Hello Internet, AdoptedMike here, and in this video we're going to be doing a $900 Skylake build for mostly for gaming. So to start off, we got the case there, and I went with the Raidmax Vortex V3. Then for the motherboard, I picked up the Gigabyte Z170XP-SLI. We're going to be putting the Core i5-6500 CPU in there. It is not overclocked or anything like that, but the customer didn't really make an interest in overclocking. They just wanted a solid Core i5. We've got 8 gigabytes of RAM there. We're using the Corsair Vengeance LPX RAM. For the GPU, we picked out a GTX 960 from EVGA. Then for the power supply, we've got an EVGA 750 watt SuperNova, and the idea behind that is for future graphics cards upgrades, or for dual graphics cards like an SLI there for the motherboard. We wanted to make sure we had a solid power supply in case he ever decided to step it up a notch with graphics cards or go SLI. For storage, we're going to be using a 1 terabyte Seagate Barracuda. We're also got a cheapo DVD reader writer drive, and this build does include a purchasing of an operating system. In this case, we've got Windows 7 Home Premium, and then we've got a Arctic Freezer 7 Pro CPU cooler there. I know we're not going to be overclocking, but I wanted to get the system as quiet as possible, and for another 20 bucks I figured that's pretty much worth it right there. And then I picked up a 4-pack of the Cooler Master silent fan there, as you can see, 120 millimeter to outfit the case with. So anyway, that goes over the parts, and now let's go ahead and get into the build. So here we'll start off with the case. As you can see, I've got the windowed side panel version, and with the little bump out there, it actually makes it pretty sturdy. It does bend a bit, but it's not as bad as, like you can see how thin it is. It's definitely not as bad as it could be, so I think the bump out gives it some rigidity. And then the other side panel is exactly the same, just without the window. It's a very lightweight case. It's very thin metal and plastic, so I would not call this like a super strong case, but once you start screwing components in, I think it will kind of balance it out a little bit. Take a little closer look there. We've got 7 expansion slots there in the back. There's a big cutout for installing a CPU cooler. Got your I/O there. It's kind of up high, so there's not much room on top. This would be probably very difficult to mount a radiator in the top, which I would imagine, I bet you probably can't, so I would not buy this case to mount a radiator up here. There is room for a 120 millimeter fan, but I bet not a radiator and a 120 mil fan. And then anyway, we got a bottom mounted power supply there, and there's 3 3.5 drive bays and 3 2.5 drive bays, and this is removable, this metal bracket here, in order to get a longer graphics card in. And then speaking of graphics cards, when you have the bracket installed, you can get a 300 millimeter graphics card across there, and then if you remove it, then you have 390 millimeters from the bracket to the front of the case. So that's something to think about depending on what graphics card you're going to use. And then if you're going to do like an SLI setup, then you have 280 millimeters before you hit this bracket, which is non-removable. So this one can be removed for the 2.5 inch drive bays, but yeah, you're definitely stuck with the 3.5 being the way that it is. But that'll just give you a rough idea. We've got some cable management cutout holes as well too back there. Unfortunately, they're not rubber grommeted, but I mean, in this kind of a budget case, you probably not looking for that anyway. So take a look at the front of the case. So we've got 2 5.25 inch drive bays there, and then we've got a power button, reset button, USB 3.0, USB 2.0, then headphone mic, power, and hard drive activity LED lights there. And then moving down a little bit as far as for like fan mounts in the front. We take a look here. We've got some cable management holes to route the fan cables. It's a little bit of an interesting front panel fan setup. You've got different mounting holes to mount a 120 at different heights, so you could put one there and then you could get one there. It's a little tight, but it does appear that you can get two 120 millimeter fans up there. So let's just take a peek here. Yep, you can get two 120 millimeter fans in the front, but if you wanted to utilize some of the flexible mounting points, like putting it here to up here, obviously you'd only get one. So if you start at the very bottom and then work your way to the very top, you can easily get two. Unfortunately, this down here is pretty restrictive. I'm not quite sure how much air is going to get pushed through here. I think that's kind of a bad place. Up here it's a little bit better, so I think this top one would handle it better, but boy, when you get down here, that's just pretty limited space, unfortunately, to blow air across. But just a few thoughts anyway. So when you get to the back of the motherboard, or excuse me, the case behind the motherboard tray, you can kind of see here what we have to work with. There's a couple of cable tie downs, but there is no space back here whatsoever. So everything that you do is going to have to fit within the bump out here on the side panel, which is, I mean, thank God this is here, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do anything behind the motherboard tray whatsoever, and then these cable tie downs would be kind of interesting to be there if you couldn't even use them. But at any rate, they are there, and it looks to be like a 24-pin cable. Shouldn't have any problem fitting behind that bump out. But there's one thing, you probably still got to be, you know, pretty tight in here when you do your cable management in order to get everything back without, you know, having an issue putting on the side panel. But you know, it's a decent system. At least we have a big cutout to install a CPU cooler or remove a CPU cooler if needed. So anyway, that kind of wraps up the case. Well, take a look at the back here real quick. Yeah, we've got the external screws for the PCI brackets. Not my favorite design. I don't particularly care for this. I'd much rather it be on the inside, but it does conserve a little bit of space by having it on the outside. I just think it's, in my opinion, it's a little less secure, but you know, what do you do? And then up here we have some water cooling hoses, so you could knock those out. You'll have to buy grommets for it, otherwise you'd have to worry about cutting your water cooling tubing. But that's good look at the case and good look at what we're going to be working with for the rest of the build. Everything else should kind of just slap together as normal. The only real variable here in this particular setup is the case. But anyway, let's go ahead and start throwing the hardware in. Alright, so I've got the motherboard out of the box, and we'll start putting the necessary hardware in it, the RAM and the CPU. But one thing I noticed is Gigabyte's got their own, they're calling it the G connector, and I thought it was interesting. It's this little piece of plastic here. Anyway, the idea is you put all your front panel connectors in here, and then it will just kind of go right into there. But a little different than, say, some of the solutions I've seen from like ASUS. You actually kind of, it plugs in such a way here, and then it kind of snaps in, if you could hear that. So now the connector is actually kind of secured in there, so just rather than just having pins that you put connect there and then down, it actually kind of locks it into this little plastic tray, and then when you pop it in, yeah, so I just thought that was kind of interesting. I wanted to point out. But anyway, yeah, moving on. And something else that I found interesting, this is my first build with a Skylake processor, and I noticed, you know, this is an i5, but it seems like you get more of the, what used to be standard for like a Celeron, or the lower end versions, that, you know, that tiny heatsink. and there's not even the copper core in the center anymore. So I think that just goes to show you how power efficient these new chips are, that they're not even needing the bigger fan that Intel used to put out, their stock fan. This is, like I said, more of like the Celeron style. So I did think that was interesting. So these chips have gotten quite a bit more power efficient, and they must be producing much less heat. So I feel very confident that my cooling solution that we're going with in this particular case is going to be more than adequate. Okay, so now we're up to, got the CPU installed, and I'm mounting that CPU cooler, and I just wanted to point out it's very similar to sort of how the push pins work on the stock cooler, but you set up this bracket for Intel, and then you kind of build these little push pins, and they do the same thing there. They push through the motherboard and lock, and then you end up with the bracket that basically the heatsink will just screw on down to. I can see how this works. It makes it to where this is usable on AMD or Intel. You just have to kind of convert either bracket to this more standardized bracket, and then boom, it will just screw onto there, and then that's how you have your heatsink. Okay, so as you can see, I'm a little bit into the build now. We've got the DVD drive installed there, motherboard's in the case, got some of the cable management started with the front panel connectors, and I did lie, I thought it was a Seagate Barracuda, but it just ended up being a 1 terabyte Toshiba drive. But anyway, just wanted to point that out. So we can take a look here around the front. I've got the 2 fans installed as well, and got the cables routed through the front, and they're ready to get plugged in, and then the front panel connectors I've got tied to the back. So far it's looking pretty good, and I will have room to put a 120 millimeter fan up top as an exhaust, but definitely you wouldn't be able to use a radiator and fan combo up top. It would start to hit the heat sink there on the motherboard, so I wouldn't go for that. But you possibly could put one back here. We're not in this build, but there appears to be enough room here to put a 120 all-in-one liquid cooler. But yeah, so that kind of gets us a little bit of an update here, and I'll just continue on. Okay, so as you can see, I've got the build completely assembled. Got the power supply installed now and the graphics card. I've also put that the back side panel on just to get a good idea about how that cable management pop-out worked there for the side, and it actually worked quite well. I was able to easily get the 8-pin connector up and behind the motherboard tray and then plugged into the top. I actually had to remove the motherboard and then put the wire in first and then install the motherboard and then snap it down. So that's one thing to think about. There wasn't enough room to install to run the 8-pin cable with the motherboard installed, so that was one little hiccup that I had to account for. Then the 24 pin had no problem sneaking behind the motherboard tray either, as well as any of the other power cables really. I was able to get the PCI Express cable through the back easily. So everything did fit behind the motherboard tray as I had hoped. SATA cables, everything was easy to tidy it all up. And then I did have to do a little bit of force. I had to lay the computer down on one side in order to push and slide the back panel on, but it wasn't much effort at all, so there was enough room back there. As far as everything else, it seems to be a pretty solid case to do a full-size build in. I can easily get another GTX 960 in there, and I still have plenty of room for that, as you can see. So even though it is a smaller ATX tower, I guess, plenty of room. We've got, plenty of room for bigger power supplies as well too. So this is actually, for as small of a case as it is, you can get quite a bit in there. I didn't even use any of the additional drive bays other than the one. So I would totally say this is a pretty solid case to work with. And yeah, as far as building in it, You know, I've used better, but I've used a hell of a lot worse as well. So anyway, that wraps up my little test fit and review of this particular Raidmax case, the Vortex V3, and then my thoughts of working in it, and then also installing a Skylake system in it. The system, by the way, runs just fine. I mean, it is what is to be expected from all the other reviewers that are doing performance reviews. It's to be expected right there. My look was more as to what can be done in this particular case, and then a sample build in it rather than a benchmarking a benchmarking video. So anyway, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments below, and I'll try to respond to them about the build. And anyway, that wraps it all up. As always, thank you for watching.